Just as JavaScript has anonymous functions, JavaScript also has anonymous objects. And so it's just a simple representation of what an object would look like. And so you enclose it in curly braces. Remember that arrays were enclosed in square brackets. And then inside, you have a series of pairs, property name, property value, property name, property value, with commas in between, but with no comma at the very end. Now, people who come from more formalized object-oriented programming languages like Java just can't understand this. They say, well, how can you possibly have an object without first defining a class? Because in those languages, object means an instance of a class. But in JavaScript, an object is really just a data structure that has fields. And so here I've made a data structure. I enclosed it in curly braces, and it has fields. It has a first name field and a last name field, and each of those fields has a value. Okay, so why would you want to do this? Why wouldn't you just define a class like we showed in the previous example, a person class or a circle class? Well, usually you do define a constructor function, a class first, and then make instances of it. But there's a lot of times where you have an object and you only have one of them. Now, if I'm going to have two different objects and they both have a first name and a last name, then definitely I should define a constructor function and call it person. If I'm going to attach methods to it, and I want those to be available in more than one instance, and I want to put it in the prototype, then of course I have to define a class. But if I just have one little simple piece of data and I want to give it some names, field names, I can just group it together and surround it in curly braces, give the property names and the values with colons in between, and the pairs with commas in between. But even more important is when you're going to get objects from the server. So later we're going to discuss AJAX. AJAX is a way of having JavaScript make a network connection to the server, get some data back, parse that data in some way, and insert the result into the page. Well, JSON, which is called JavaScript Object Notation, is basically an anonymous object that comes in as a string from the server. And it looks just like the string above, or looks very similar to the string above. Okay, so here's a quick example. I'm defining a person variable. But I didn't define a person class. I just have one of these, one thing that looks like this. I don't have multiple things that look like this. I'm not planning on having additional ones. And I have a bunch of property name, property value pairs. For each pair, between the property name and the property value, I have a colon. And between each pair, I have a comma. And I can even do this nested. So I have a best friend property that also has a first name and a last name. And the values can even be functions. So I have a greeting property whose value is a function. Now again, I want to stress, it's only used when you are going to make only one instance that looks like this. Rather than making a constructor function and using the constructor function once and only once, you just define the object directly. It's simpler. However, if there's any possibility that you're going to make more than one instance, then definitely make a constructor function. If you start off by making an anonymous object and then later you say, oh wait, I need something else that looks just like it, then refactor your code. Go back and change your code, make a constructor function, and make both instances use the constructor function. All right, let me give a brief example of using this anonymous object. Okay, so here's the anonymous object shown on the previous slide. I make a variable, and the value of the variable is not a call to a constructor function, but it's just directly an object. So I have some curly braces, and inside the curly braces, I have property name, property value pairs. Between the property name and the property value, I have a colon, and between the pairs, I have a comma. And the value of some of the properties can themselves be an anonymous object, and the value of some of the properties can also be functions. So I run this, and then I can say person dot first name, person dot last name, person dot best friend dot first name, person dot best friend dot last name. And this is a little bit of a hidden snarky comment because Brendan Eich was the original developer of JavaScript, and Chris Wilson was the longtime lead of JavaScript development at Microsoft. And to say that they were best friends might be a moderate exaggeration. However, despite that little snarky comment, with Microsoft Edge, the latest browser from Microsoft in Windows 10, it is very standards compliant. And the JavaScript engine is very standards compliant and is considered quite fast in catching up with the leading browsers in JavaScript implementations, which were primarily Chrome, followed by Firefox. All right, so anonymous objects are useful. If you just have one instance, you don't have to define a class first. It seems strange to people who come from stricter object-oriented programming languages, but it's used widely in JavaScript. Not only for JSON data from the server, we'll discuss that later, but just in your own direct code. Speaking of Internet Explorer, I just wanted to make one quick comment, which is Firefox and Chrome, if you put an extra comma at the end of an array or an extra comma at the end of an anonymous object definition, Firefox and Chrome will just ignore it. But many Internet Explorer versions will crash. Now, in this particular instance, I would say that Firefox and Chrome are wrong. There's not supposed to be a comma at the end. And if your implementation accepts illegal code, it might encourage people to write illegal code. So in this particular case, I would say Internet Explorer is right. But regardless of who is right, the point is you should not have an extra comma at the end. And of course, you might ask, well, why would I put an extra comma at the end? You told me not to. Well, the reason you sometimes get extra commas at the end is when you're building anonymous objects or arrays on the server and sending it back to the client. And if you're doing this manually on the server, it's kind of natural, especially if you have an array, to kind of loop. And you just put a square bracket, and then you start looping down your data, and you put the data, and you put a comma, and you put your data, and you put a comma, and you put your data, and you put a comma, and so forth. And you don't want to have a special case for the very last one to leave off the comma. And so server-side programmers have sometimes become lazy and not put in that special case and just looped down and built something that looked like a JavaScript array on the server and put commas after everything, including the last element. And then only later, when they tested on Internet Explorer, because they did their initial testing on Chrome or Firefox because of the development environment, only later did they discover that it was actually illegal. So don't put commas at the end of arrays or anonymous objects. So anonymous objects give us a segue into JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. So the idea is that you can take a string and turn it into an object. You can take an anonymous object inside a string, or another way of saying it is a string whose content looks like an anonymous object, and turn it into a real JavaScript object. So strings that look like JavaScript objects are called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation strings. And they've become quite popular as a data interchange format, not just in JavaScript. Now, the most popular way of using JSON is when one end of the communication is in JavaScript. In particular, in a web application, the server, which might be running C# or Ruby or PHP or Java, sends a string over that is in JSON format. In other words, it looks like a JavaScript object, and then the JavaScript parses it. But JSON can even be used when a Ruby program is talking to a PHP program. And it's become kind of the simplified version of what people tried to do earlier with Corba, a way of interchanging data across multiple languages. JavaScript has this thing called eval. Eval is very powerful and very general purpose. It'll take any string at all whose content looks like JavaScript and basically evaluate it as if you had typed it into JavaScript in the first place. And this is precisely what Firebug uses. It takes a string that you've typed in and it passes it to eval. But for web applications, when you're getting data from the server, people nowadays use a more restricted function. They use a function called json.parse. The string that comes in is much more restricted. It can't look like any random piece of JavaScript code. It looks like an anonymous object or an array definition in a much more restricted format, and we'll look at that restricted format shortly. And this is what jQuery, which we'll cover later, uses when it gets data from the server. It can't take any random string whose content looks like JavaScript, like Firebug does. It takes strings in a more restricted format. And the reason for doing this is twofold. One, efficiency. Programming languages don't have to know how to make any random piece of JavaScript code. They only have to know how to take their data structures and turn it into a much more restricted format. So it's easier for other programming languages that run on the server, like Ruby or Python or Java or PHP or C# to build the data that the browser is going to use. And also safety. You don't have to worry that someone is slipping you somehow, a function that's going to mess up the page or steal some data or, pop up ugly dialog boxes with, bad data in them. Okay, so eval is very rich. You can take any string whose content looks like it would be JavaScript, and you pass it to eval. And it's as if you had run the JavaScript code on the first line directly. Now, if the string is in simple format, you pass it directly to eval. But there's a funny exception. If the string starts with curly braces, the JavaScript parser is going to be confused because curly braces are used in other places, like for delimiting blocks, like in an if statement or a for statement, grouping statements together. And so if you have curly braces in the string, eval won't know that you really mean an object literal. It might think that you're trying to delimit statements. So you have to stick parentheses around it first and then eval it. Now, again, json.parse is what we're going to use when we get data from the server. And jQuery actually uses that internally. We're not going to call it ourselves. So eval is mostly used if you want to do some sort of application similar to Firebug, where you're getting data from the user, interpreting it as JavaScript, and then evaluating it back into the page.